In this regards, Augustine is to be observed in the following. 1. There are two things on which all interpretation of Scripture depends: the mode of ascertaining the proper meaning, and the mode of making known the meaning when it is ascertained. We shall treat first of the mode of ascertaining, next of the mode of making known the meaning, a great and arduous undertaking, and one that, if difficult to carry out, it is, I fear, presumptuous to enter upon. And presumptuous it would undoubtedly be if I were counting on my own strength. But since my hope of accomplishing the work rests on Him who has already supplied me with many thoughts on this subject, I do not fear but that He will go on to supply what is yet wanting when once I have begun to use what He has already given. For a possession which is not diminished by being shared with others, if it is possessed and not shared, is not yet possessed as it ought to be possessed. The Lord saith, Whosoever hath, to him shall be given. He will give then to those who have, that is to say, if they use freely and cheerfully what they have received, He will add to and perfect His gifts. The loaves in the miracle were only 5 and 7 in number. The disciples began to divide them among the hungry people. But when once they began to distribute them, though the wants of so many thousands were satisfied, they filled baskets with the fragment that were left. Now just as the bread increased in the very act of breaking it, so those thoughts which the Lord has already vouchsafed to me, with a view to undertaking this work, will, as soon as I begin to impart them to others, be multiplied by His grace, so that in this very work of distribution in which I have engaged, so far from incurring loss and poverty, I shall be made to rejoice in a marvelous increase of wealth. He was very emphatic on the only way the Scriptures should be interpreted. On this he wrote, 2. All instruction is either about things or about signs, but things are learnt by means of signs. I now use the word thing in a strict sense to signify that which is never employed as a sign of anything else. For example, wood, stone, cattle, and other things of that kind. Not, however, the wood which we read Moses cast into the bitter waters to make them sweet, nor the stone which Jacob used as a pillow, nor the ram which Abraham offered up in place of his son, etc. Of course, he was as presumptive on the ineffability of God. Have I spoken to God or uttered His praise in any worthy way? Nay, I feel that I have done nothing more than desire to speak, and if I had said anything, it is not what I desired to say. How do I know this, except from the fact that God is unspeakable? But what have I said, if it had been unspeakable, could not have been spoken? And so God is not even to be called unspeakable, because to say even this is to speak to Him. Thus there arises a curious contradiction of words, because of it is not unspeakable if it can be called unspeakable. And this opposition of words is rather to be avoided by silence than to be explained away by speech. And yet God, although nothing worthy of His greatness can be said of Him, has condescended to accept the worship of men's mouths, and has desired us through the medium of our own words to rejoice in His praise. For on this principle it is that He is called Deus, or God. For the sound of those two syllables in itself conveys no true knowledge of His nature, but yet all who know Latin tongue are led when that sound reaches their ears to think of a nature supreme in excellence and eternal in existence. The question of what is sacred or profane literature has been around with mankind for quite a long time. On this subject, Augustine wrote the following: But when unacquainted with other modes of life than their own meet with the record of such actions, unless they are restrained by authority, they look upon them as sins, and do not consider that their own customs, either in regard to marriage or feast or dress, or the other necessities and adornments of human life, appear sinful to the people of other nations and other times. And, distracted by this endless variety of customs, some who were half asleep, as I may say, that is, who were neither sunk in the deep sleep of folly, nor were able to awake into the light of wisdom, have thought that there was no such thing as absolute right, but that every nation took its own custom for right, and that since every nation has a different custom, and right must remain unchangeable, it becomes manifest that there is no such thing as right at all. Such men did not perceive, to take only one example, that the precept, "Whatsoever ye would that men should do to you, do ye even so to them," cannot be altered by any diversity of national customs. And this precept, when it is referred to the love of God, destroys all vices, when to the love of one's neighbor, puts an end to all crimes. For no one is willing to defile his own dwelling. He ought not, therefore, to defile the dwelling of God, that is, himself. And no one wishes an injury to be done him by another, be himself, therefore ought not to do injury to another. On divinely inspired authors and authority, he wrote, "Here perhaps someone inquires whether the authors whose divinely inspired writings constitute the canon, which carries with it a most wholesome authority, are to be considered wise only, or eloquent as well. A question which to me, and to those who think with me, is very easily settled. For where I understand these writers, it seems to me not only that nothing can be wiser, but also that nothing can be more eloquent. And I venture to affirm that all who truly understand what these writers say perceive at the same time that it could not have been properly said in any other way." Augustine's writings, as seen in this work, although only a very limited amount of extracts from 3 of his most famous, show much of the insight he revealed to his fellow Christians, which made them adopt his teachings as the basic concepts of Christianity, as developed in the North African Church under indigenous Africans, from the 4th through the present 20th century. For example, in speaking about and against the Manichaeans, Augustine called upon Scriptures, as he always did, to convince his audience. Thus, in the Confessions, Book 1, he wrote, "Do the heaven and earth then contain thee, since thou fillest them? Or dost thou fill them and yet overflow, since they do not contain thee? And whither, when the heaven and the earth are filled, pourest thou forth the remainder of thyself? Or hast thou no need that aught contain thee, who containest all things, since what thou fillest containing it?" One sees that even in questioning things, Augustine was at the same time emphasizing what he thought to be his God's commands, with respect to the answers. This type of questionary directives have become the standard procedural escape for members of the Christian clergy to this very date, and the clergy have since employed it as a means of answering all questions for which they do not have any hard and fast answers, especially for questions dealing with the origin of God himself or the realism of Christ's virgin birth. Augustine not only taught his Christian brethren on Christian doctrines, he also taught them how to apply their own feelings and propaganda of the faith in his book 4 of the same quoted title. For example, in chapter 30, subtitled, "The Preacher Should Commence His Discourse with Prayer to God," but it was Augustine who would do this best, as it is seen in subsection 63 of the above-mentioned work. But whether a man is going to address the people or to dictate what others will deliver or read to the people, he ought to pray God to put into his mouth a suitable discourse. For if Queen Esther prayed when she was about to speak to the king touching the temporal welfare of her people, that God put fit words into her mouth, how much more ought he to pray for the same blessing who labors in word and doctrine for the eternal welfare of men? Those again who are to deliver what others compose for them ought, before they receive their discourse, to pray for those who are preparing it. And when they have received it, they ought to pray both that they themselves may deliver it well, and that those to whom the address it may give ear, and when the discourse has a happy issue, they ought to render thanks to him from whom they know such blessings come. so that all the praise may be his, in whose hand are both we and our words. Typical of his technique, Augustine called upon the book of Esther, chapter 4, verse 16, and Wisdom, chapter 7, verse 16, for scriptures that would gain for himself what he obviously believed to be biblical approval. Even in recognizing his own limitations, Augustine made it seem that through himself and his own teachings were the only ways to salvation. This is best seen in the last chapter in On Christian Doctrines, Book 4. This book has extended to a greater length than I expected or desired, but the reader or bearer who finds pleasure in it will not think it long. He who thinks it too long, but is anxious to know its contents, may read it in parts. He who does not care to be acquainted with it need not complain of its length. I, however, give thanks to God that with what little ability I possess, I have in these 4 books striven to depict not the sort of man I am myself, for my defects are very many, but the sort of man he ought to be, who desires to labor in sound, that is, in Christian doctrine, not for his own instruction only, but for that of others also. Much of the dogmatism in European and European American style Christianity today comes from the positions and attitudes in Augustine's writings. However, it is frequently stated that, quote, St. Augustine's brilliance was due to his study of the works of Homer, Socrates, Plato, Virgil, Aristotle, and other Greeks. While it is true that Augustine ardently studied the works of the Greeks mentioned above, it is equally true that their works came down from the teachings they received from the indigenous Africans of Egypt or Sais, Ethiopia or Cush, and other indigenous Africans of the nations along the 3 branches of the Nile River, the Blue Nile, White Nile, and Atbara River, also from North, West, East, and Central Africa, Alkebulan. This is best shown in Yosef Ben-Jochannan's Black Man of the Nile. All of these Africans were influenced by other indigenous Africans further south of Mediterranean North Africa, above and below the equator. For example, was it possible for Aristotle, who was never known to have written a single book before he left his native Greece, to suddenly write over 1,000 books after he joined Alexander the Great in the invasion and conquest of Egypt in 332 BC? And was it possible that he and the thousands of Greek students he imported into Egypt for the sole purpose of being taught by indigenous African teachers from the books and other documents of the royal libraries which Alexander captured and Ptolemy I seized, did not claim most of the indigenous African works as their own? None of these 2 questions needs any lengthy explanation, for history has already detailed the fact that the royal library, which Aristotle and Ptolemy renamed Library of Alexandria, was used as a school for training in all disciplines of all the pre-Christian Greek students, and they made very certain that Egyptian and other indigenous African students were barred from further studies therein. Yet the first teachers of these and former Greeks were all indigenous African priests of the quote-unquote mysteries. The chief priest of the school was Manetho, the African who divided Egyptian history into pre-dynastic and dynastic periods. Moreover, was it not the universal custom for all invading armies, the Greeks in particular, to ravage their victims' women, loot their victims' treasures and treasuries, including all sorts of written documents, and sack their cities? The Greeks, like the Persians, Assyrians, and Hyksos that preceded them into Egypt as conquerors, ravaged northeast Africa, just as they ravaged everywhere else they had conquered, Europe not excluded. This short departure from St. Augustine's legacy was very much necessary, in order that it be clearly understood that his works were not, to any great extent, influenced by those who are usually misnomered Greek philosophers per se, but that indigenous African philosophers of North Africa and along the entire 4,100-mile-long Nile River Valley, from Uganda to the Mediterranean Sea, formerly the Egyptian Sea or Sea of Sais, and throughout Africa were the originators of much of what is alluded to by Western educators as of Greek origins, and that they too directly influenced him. Even those indigenous Africans, called mystics, with their juju and abya, who were his contemporaries, had their effects on him, and molded much of his thinking and philosophical expressions in his writings. To say that St. Augustine's expressions in any or all of his works were developed only as a result of his studies under the Latin Church Fathers, and in particular St. Ambrose, after he completed his professorship in Milan, along with his readings of the Greek works, such as Virgil's Aeneid, would be to ignore his earliest experiences with his father's religion in his native Tagaste, Numidia, North Africa. It would be also ignoring St. Augustine's own background as a young man in Carthage, North Africa. And of course, it would be willingly overlooking the debt of his own involvement with his mother, Monica, and his son, Adeodatus, both of whose death stunned him most severely, all of which he spoke about very strongly in his Confessions. It is impossible for Augustine not to have been more than casually influenced by his indigenous African religious background in his native North Africa, especially since he was already 28 years old when he left Africa for his one and only visit to Europe, Milan and Rome, to serve as a professor. Not only was he affected by his indigenous African high culture in Numidia and Carthage, but his constant reflections on celibacy throughout most of his writings indicate the effects which his out-of-wedlock son's birth had on him. The son being referred to is the one and only child Augustine ever had, Adeodatus. This mortal man, irrespective of being declared a saint by those who are in charge of making saints after death, those who followed him by hundreds of years within the religion he helped to stabilize and to become the powerful force it is today, even though his descendants are now barred from any of its doors, was still haunted by his earlier life before he entered Christendom, which he revealed with deepest remorse in his Confessions. To say that St. Augustine's early life, on the other hand, was a sordid one, as so many have stated in hundreds of works dealing with sin and righteousness, is a value judgment which only those whose particular morals and religious convictions follow such directions, for it is obvious, or it should be, that none of his early youth indulgences were against the social mores or religious scruples of the majority of the people of Carthage before the dominance of that country's indigenous and traditional culture, which included religion and social mores by the people of the new religion, Christianity. The truth of the matter is best expressed in St. Augustine's own work, when he said that, quote, each nation has its own morals, etc. The fact that St. Augustine's father, Patricius, never saw it fitting to convert to the new religion from Manichaeism also had to have its effect on him. It had to have certain adverse reactions on him, as his respect and deep love for his non-Christian father, Patricius, was as crucial as that for his mother, Monica, who was a convert from the same religion of his father, Manichaeism, to Christianity. Is it to be assumed that they did not carry over any of their beliefs from Manichaeism into Christianity? If so, then Christianity is also free from the carryovers from the Hebrewism, also called Judaism in modern times. The strange fact in this specific argument is that St. Augustine nowhere mentioned any difficulty between his parents as a result of their differences in religious persuasions, and he did not indicate if either parent tried to convince the other of which was the right or wrong way to religious conscience. One can then conclude that there was individual tolerance and religious freedom throughout Numidia and Carthage during St. Augustine's youthful days, both countries at the time being Roman provinces. What is so different in St. Augustine's writing in On Christian Doctrines from other indigenous Africans expressed in Voodoo, Juju, Dambalaquedo, and other traditional African religions except for the Godhead, Jesus Christ, which makes Christianity quote unquote truth and the others mentioned a lie? The answer is belief, and sometimes this belief is manifested with gunpowder and or economic persuasion, as seen in Mr. Achebe's book, Things Fall Apart, in the first chapter of this work. Christianity, like Judaism and Islam, is not static. It too adds to its own development from every culture and religion in which it comes into contact, all of which is in evidence in St. Augustine's writings with respect to libations, oracles, Greek philosophers, etc. In Egypt, or Sais, Christianity was basically indigenous Egyptian in almost every aspect. As Christianity moved across North Africa to Numidia and Carthage, birthplaces of the African Christian fathers of the Church, the indigenous Africans there reformed and adopted much of its Egyptian format to suit Numidian and Carthaginian culture and religious customs. And as Christianity entered each European colonized nation throughout Asia, the Americas, and the islands of the world, it became the national religion through force and violence. Yet, Christianity was forced to accept many of the local taboos in order to co-opt the local religion. This was done in the name of Jesus Christ. Yet, with soldiers marching with guns, as they sang, "Onward, Christian soldiers, marching unto war with the cross of Jesus," etc., at the same time suppressing all other religions, forgetting their own oppression. This type of behavior is not only common to Christian institutions, each and every other religious institution powerful enough to finance mercenaries or build its own armies, such as the ancient Hebrews in the Bible, and Muslims through their jihads have been willing and did enforce its will upon unbelievers, those who had other religions which their forerunners passed down to them, and they have done so all through history, stopping only when they too become too weak militarily. But Christianity, which suffered a most terrible beginning, today has become the major religion of the people whose fortune or misfortune it is to control the most extensive arsenal of weapons of destruction the world has ever witnessed. The Christian nations have used such power to their own selfish gain. They are also able to control the less fortunate peoples of the entire world, along with communism, in a manner which millions cannot call Christ-like or even the Christian way of life, as established in North Africa. This is still true, and it was especially so during the periods of imposed slavery when mankind purchased his brother in chains and enforced colonialism upon the indigenous African peoples of Africa, Asia, and the Americas. It was also true to some extent when most of the smaller national groupings in Europe were subjected to a similar type of treatment. These acts are considered part of the same Christian development that the African fathers of Christendom, Tertullian, St. Cyprian, and St. Augustine, crystallized in the North African Church and influenced the European Church. To this there is not the slightest bit of truth. It is necessary at this juncture to examine St. Augustine's acceptance or rejection of the Greek and Latin Church Fathers' teaching, also the so-called Greek philosophers. In so doing, one must pay very careful attention to the exception Augustine took to Cicero's mannerism in refuting the Stoics. For example, in chapter 9, paragraph 1, he wrote, "And this he," Cicero, "attempts to accomplish by denying there is any knowledge of future things, and maintains with all his might that there is no such knowledge either in God or man, and that there is no predictions of events. Thus he both denies the foreknowledge of God, and attempts by vain arguments and by opposing to himself certain oracles very easy to be refuted, to overthrow all prophecy, even such as is clearer than the light, though even these oracles are not refuted by him." Besides differing with Cicero, one finds Augustine holding steadfast to the Manichaeans' belief in oracles, a carry-over from his early indigenous religion, which he was born into in his native Numidia, North Africa. Yet he also condemned Cicero for believing in one Greek god, Jupiter, as he questioned Cicero's quoting the following Homeric verse from the Odyssey, book number 18, pages 136 and 137. Such are the minds of men, as is the light which Father Love himself doth pour illustrious over the fruitful earth. Indigenous African religions and Western religions broadly cite certain basic characteristics common to all religions, yet they are regarded as paganism by the current practitioners of Christianity, Islam, and Judaism when applied to Africa and the indigenous African peoples. This is also noted in St. Augustine's defense of Christian oracles, as he condemns the Greek paganism, that which he chose to call Greek mythology. But in his zeal, he then, like others now, failed to take note that the mythology in the so-called Western religions, Judaism and Christianity, sometimes Islam, stemmed from the original source, the source in Africa where the Greeks received their fundamentals in philosophy. What is an oracle anyway? In common parlance, it is no more or less a fortune teller than any local gypsy mystic one sees around the neighborhood giving out numbers for the local bookies. They were supposed then, as they are now, to be able to prophesy the future. Of course, the best ones were those who belonged to the religion of the person they had served. In the case of St. Augustine, it was the oracles that damned the Greek gods and blessed the Hebrew and Christian gods. The Muslim god, Allah, not having been created by Muhammad during Augustine's lifetime due to Muhammad's lateness of birth, with respect to Augustine's many centuries after 370 CE, made it impossible for Augustine to accept Allah in this light. Augustine further answered a question when he asked of Cicero in chapter 9, fourth paragraph, the following: "Neither let us be afraid, lest after all we do not by will that which we do by will, because he, Jesus Christ, whose foreknowledge is infallible, foreknew that we would do it. He was this which Cicero was afraid of, and therefore opposed foreknowledge. The Stoics also maintained that all things do not come to pass by necessity, although they contended that all things happened according to destiny. What is it then that Cicero feared in the prescience of future things? Like most of his contemporaries of Christendom, his predecessors and followers, Augustine also despised scientists. At least, he verbally scorned them into oblivion. One can see in Augustine's writings the utter contempt he held for Cicero's position was not motivated by hatred for the man, but for the position Cicero took on things spiritual, which, if they disagreed with Augustine's point of view with respect to his own God, Jesus Christ, he had to condemn. Augustine's attitude in this regard was still the common attitude of modern Christian clergymen and laymen. This is best seen when one reads the following comments by Augustine in the City of God, Book 6, Chapter 14. But as this divine master inculcates two precepts, the love of God and the love of our neighbor, and as in these precepts a man finds three things he has to love, God, himself, and his neighbors, and that he who loves God loves himself thereby, it follows that he must endeavor to get his neighbor to love God, since he is ordered to love his neighbor as himself. This was part of the genius of St. Augustine, just as it was with his two other indigenous African predecessors, Tertullian and St. Cyprian. They too never indulged in character assassination of their opponents, but of their works. Yet it cannot be said that they were not dogmatically Christian fanatics. They had to be, because they had become the authorities and philosophers on Christian doctrines and on Christendom itself. Expecting them to have done otherwise would be tantamount to expecting the present Pope in Rome to accept that Judaism or Islam would get you into heaven as easily as Roman Catholicism, or at least by way of Protestantism. To expect that a grand rabbi or a chief imam would accept the reverse in the case of Christianity would be equally as absurd. And therefore, although our righteous father had slaves and administered their domestic affairs so as to distinguish both the condition of slaves and the heirship of sons in regard to the blessings of this life, yet in regard to the worship of God, Jesus Christ, in whom we hope for eternal blessings, they took an equally loving oversight of all members of their household. The above comment followed chapter 15, the last sentence of St. Augustine's book, Holy City of God, in which he also wrote the following: And therefore the apostle admonishes slaves to be subject to their masters and to serve them heartily and with good will, so that if they cannot be freed by their masters, they may themselves make their slavery in some sort free, by serving not in crafty fear, but in faithful love, until all unrighteousness pass away, and all principality and every human power be brought to nothing, and God be all in all. St. Augustine's compassionate feelings for the slaves he was speaking of did not make him react differently when he responded to Cicero's position on prophecy or the oracles. He still saw in this brutal relationship between man to man, with a sense of tranquility for the slaves, that is, if they maintained law and order, and were obedient to their masters and to Jesus Christ. This type of logic still permeates the thinking of modern Christians, as it prevails in European-style Christian ethics and practices within the so-called Christian nations of the world and other smaller communities. A kind of don't rock the boat, Jesus will take care of it all philosophy. In these areas, St. Augustine's philosophical, moral, and spiritual thoughts in his writings reflected the Romanized African upper-middle-class background from which he came. This was especially true because of the following reasons. A. It must be remembered that he was already 28 years of age before he began any serious devotion to the new religion, Christianity. B. That his father, Patricius, was a minor official in the provincial government of the native Numidia, a position which Augustine condemned other Africans for holding in the Roman Empire. C. That he had grown up within a system which normally accepted and benefited immensely from the proceeds of slavery. D. And that the North African Christian Church itself had become engaged in slavery, to the extent that many of its highest officials benefited to the point of becoming some of the wealthiest slave masters. These precedents led to the acceptance of slavery as an economic base for European and European American Christian governments approximately 1,030 years after Augustine's death, when Pope Martin V accepted from Prince Henry, the so-called navigator of Portugal, the first 5 slaves kidnapped on the west coast of Africa, and gold dust stolen from the same place by his fellow European Christians. This conduct of European-style Christian depravity that enhanced Augustine's followers' coffers, both secularly and religiously, was yet to be the basis for the expansion of slavery, as it became the major source of Christendom's financial empire 535 years later, at which time the Right Reverend Bishop Bartolomeo de las Casas, 1474 to 1566 CE, got King Charles I of Spain and Pope Clement VII, Giulio de' Medici, to endorse the inauguration of the infamous chattel slave trade that introduced the genocidal depopulation of the entire continent of Africa and the forced migration of millions of Africans to the quote-unquote New World, which to a great extent continues on today. Since Augustine did not condemn slavery in his teachings, his silence gave comfort later on to the Reverend John Hawkins, captain of the notorious slave ship Jesus Christ, to murder and enslave Africans in the name of Christianity and civilization. But slavery was also ordained by the Hebrews against the Amalekites, Hittites, Moabites, and others before they finally committed genocide against them, just as the European Christians sang their religious war chants, "Onward, Christian soldiers, marching on to war," etc., in memory of the cross of Jesus they carried as they enslaved the Muslims during the various crusades, justifying their barbarous actions of what they claim was a call from God to save the world. Augustine's moralization of, quote, salvation through Christ, should the slaves accept law and order by the state church, equally their masters, was grounded in the following passages of the Hebrew and Christian Holy Scriptures, which was supposedly written by holy men inspired by God, meaning, of course, only males of the Hebrew, Christian, and maybe of the Muslim religions. Thus, Exodus chapter 21, verses 1 to 25, etc., as noted in the laws concerning slavery. Quote, "Now these are the ordinances which thou shalt set before them. If thou buy an Hebrew servant, 6 years he shall serve, and in the 7th he shall go out free for nothing. If he came in by himself, he shall go out by himself. If he was married, then his wife shall go out with him. If his master have given him a wife, and she have borne him sons or daughters, the wife and her children shall be her master's, and he shall go out by himself. And if the servant shall plainly say, I love my master, my wife, and my children, I will not go out free, then his master shall bring him unto the judges. He shall also bring him to the door, or unto the door post, and his master shall bore his ear through with an awl, and he shall serve him forever. And if a man sell his daughter to be a maidservant, she shall not go out as the men servants do. If she please not her master, who hath betrothed her to himself, then shall he let her be redeemed. To sell her unto a foreign nation he shall have no power, seeing he hath dealt deceitfully with her. And if he hath betrothed her unto his son, he shall deal with her after the manner of daughters. If he take him another wife, her food, her raiment, and her duty of marriage shall he not diminish. And if he do not these three unto her, then shall she go out free without money. He that smiteth a man, so that he die, shall be surely put to death. And if a man lie not in wait, but God deliver him into his hand, then I will appoint thee a place to which he shall flee. But if a man come presumptuously upon his neighbor to slay him with guile, thou shalt take him from mine altar, that he may die. And he that smiteth his father or his mother shall be surely put to death. And he that stealeth a man and selleth him, or if he be found in his hand, he shall surely be put to death. And he that curseth his father or his mother shall surely be put to death. And if men strive together, and one smite another with a stone or with his fist, and he die not, but keepeth his bed, if he rise again and walk abroad upon his staff, then shall he that smote him be clear, only shall pay for the loss of his time, and shall cause him to be thoroughly healed. And if a man smite his servant or his maid with a rod, and he die under his hand, he shall be severely punished. Notwithstanding, if he continue a day or two, he shall not be punished, for he is his money. If men strive, and hurt a woman with child, so that her fruit depart from her, and yet no mischief follows, he shall be surely punished, according as the woman's husband will lay upon him, and he shall pay as the judges determine. And if any mischief follows, then thou shalt give life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burning for burning, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. Augustine's writing on this subject was in reality only a refinement of the moral and spiritual justification for his contemporaries to follow, as he, being the Christian father of the church at the time, could not accept that the Holy Scriptures, Vulgate Bible, were unjust. As such, he completely appeased the slave masters, Jewish and Christians alike, to the fullest of his ability, as seen in the last sentence of his City of God, Book 19, Chapter 20. He wrote, "For the true blessings of the soul are not enjoyed, for that is no true wisdom which does not direct all its prudent observations, manly actions, virtuous self-restraint, and just arrangements to that end in which God shall be all in a secure eternity and perfect peace." One must understand, however, that St. Augustine did not acquiesce to racial, religious, or national identification as the means by which a specific group was most fitted for enslavement, as do the Calvinist, Latter-day Saints, or Mormons, and other white Protestant, Roman Catholic, and Jewish sects in the southwestern and southeastern sections of Africa. Also others of these contemporaries in the United States of America. He saw the institution of slavery, when every type of humanity was enslaved, to slave masters who were as varied as their slaves, which included Europeans, Asians, and Africans as masters and slaves. As a matter of fact, Augustine's homeland was a part of the coast of the Barbary. Jane Soam's book of like name so correctly described later on Christian writers of all types, including the Roman Catholic Christian missionary Raymond Lull of the world-famous Lull Reports, who did everything within his power to become a martyr for Christendom, also came and lived to stem the tide of Islam. It was also a place where the vast majority of the slaves came, from as far off as Angloland, England or Britain, and were of European origin, Caucasian or white. In dealing with political matters, St. Augustine severely criticized Cicero's work, De Republica, in which Cicero supported Scipio Afer's, or Africanus, or Scipio the African, definition of just what is the vital fabric of any republic. As such, one finds St. Augustine writing the following remarks in his City of God, Book 19, Chapter 21. "This, then, is the place where I should fulfill the promise I gave in the second book of this work, and explain, as briefly and clearly as possible, that if we are to accept the definitions laid down by Scipio in Cicero's De Republica, there never was a Roman Republic, for he briefly defines a republic as the will of the people. And if this definition be true, there never was a Roman Republic, for the people's will was never attained among the Romans. For the people, according to his definition, is an assemblage associated by a common acknowledgment of right and by a community of interest. And what he means by a common acknowledgment of right, he explains at large, showing that a republic cannot be administered without justice. Where, therefore, there is no true justice, there can be no right. For that which is done by right is justly done, and what is unjustly done cannot be done by right. For the unjust inventions of men are neither to be considered nor spoken of as rights, for even they themselves say that right is that which flows from the fountain of justice, and deny the definition which is commonly given by those who misconceive the matter, that right is that which is useful to the stronger party. Thus, where there is not true justice, there can be no assemblage of men associated by a common acknowledgment of right, and therefore there can be no people, as defined by Scipio or Cicero, And if no people, then no will of the people, but only of some promiscuous multitude, unworthy of the name of people. Consequently, if the republic is the will of the people, and there is no people, if it be not associated by a common acknowledgment of right, and there is no right where there is no justice, then most certainly it follows that there is no republic where there is no justice. Further, justice is that virtue which gives everyone his due. Where then is justice of man? When he deserts the true God and yields himself to impure demons. Is this to give everyone his due? Or is he who keeps back a piece of ground from the purchaser and gives it to a man who has no right to it unjust, while he who keeps back himself from the God who made him and serves wicked spirits is just? Augustine's writings in the City of God and on Christian doctrines showed that he had such contempt for man's society on earth that he felt it necessary at all times to ignore the material for the spiritual. He therefore wrote in condemnation of all that did not, in his estimation, meet prevailing biblical and philosophical prophecy, which he based upon Christian values as he understood them. In chapter 37 of On Christian Doctrines, Book 3, St. Augustine, from this writer's observation, outlined the spiritual values upon which he condemned the failure of man to develop what he believed to be a, quote, true republic. Thus, in outlining what he called the seventh rule of Tychonius, he wrote, "The seventh rule of Tychonius, and the last, is about the devil and his body. For he is the head of the wicked, who are in a sense his body, and destined to go with him into the punishment of everlasting fire, just as Christ is the head of the church, which is his holy body, destined to be with him in his eternal kingdom and glory. Accordingly, as the first rule, which is called of the Lord and his body, directs us, when Scripture speaks of one and the same person, to take pains to understand which part of the statement applies to the head and which to the body. So that this last rule shows us that statements are sometimes made about the devil, whose truth is not so evident in regard to himself as in regard to his body, and his body is made up not only of those who are manifestly out of the way, but of those also who, though they really belong to him, are for a time mixed up with the church, until they depart from this life, or until the chaff is separated from the wheat at the last great winnowing. For example, what is said in Isaiah, how he is fallen from heaven, Lucifer, son of the morning, and the other statements of the context which, under the figure of the king of Babylon, are made about the same person, are of course to be understood of the devil, and yet the statement which is made in the same place, he is ground down on the earth, who sends to all nations, does not altogether fitly apply to the head himself. For although the devil sends his angels to all nations, yet it is his body, not himself, that is ground down on the earth, except that he himself is in his body, which is beaten small like the dust which the wind blows from the face of the earth." In Book 4 of the above work, Chapter 2, however, he refuted his own position by suggesting that it is right to use falsehoods in defense of Christianity. Of course, he did not mention the word Christianity specifically, being that he was a master of the art of rhetoric, which he relied upon very heavily in his analysis. For example, on the issue of rhetoric, Augustine wrote, "This work of mine, which is entitled On Christian Doctrine, was at the commencement divided into two parts, for after a preface, in which I answered by anticipation those who were likely to take exception to the work, I said, there are two things on which all interpretation of Scripture depends, the mode of ascertaining the proper meaning, and the mode of making known the meaning when it is ascertained. I shall treat first of the mode of ascertaining, next of the mode of making known the meaning. As then, I have already said a great deal about the mode of ascertaining the meaning, and have given 3 books to this one part of the subject, I shall only say a few things about the mode of making known the meaning, in order, if possible, to bring them all within the compass of one book, and so finish the whole work in 4 books. In the first place, then, I wish by this preamble to put a stop to the expectations of readers who may think that I am about to lay down rules of rhetoric such as I have learned, and taught too, in the secular schools, and to warn them that they need not look for any such from me. Not that I think such rules of no use, but that whatever use they have is to be learned elsewhere, and if any good man should happen to have leisure for learning them, he is not to ask me to teach them either in this work or any other. Augustine continued from this point to speak of the age one had to acquire before he could become a skilled master in rhetoric, in chapter 3, and culminated it with the duties of said orator and a Christian teacher in chapter 4. As usual, he had to add his own personal values of Christian purity for this skill also, as he elaborated on the necessity for, quote, the sacred writer's eloquence with wisdom. One can only wonder if this master of rhetoric and poetic spirituality recognized himself for the genius he was. If not, these writings certainly betrayed his inner self in this direction. Augustine's assuredness about Christianity and the world to come, heaven, brings to memory the following remarks in the Hebrew Scriptures, as stated in the Torah, or 5 books of Moses. Exodus chapter 14, verses 13 and 14. And Moses said unto the people, Fear ye not, stand still, and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will work for you today. For whereas ye have seen the Egyptians today, ye shall see them again no more forever. The Lord will fight for you, and he shall hold your peace. The 6-Day War in June 1967 between the Asian population that presently occupy and control Egypt and the European and European American population that occupy and control Israel is a far cry from the prophecy stated. These 2 new foreign encroachments probably would have caused St. Augustine very serious consternation if he were alive today, as he would have realized that many of the prophecies he held to be infallible with regards to Israel and Egypt were in fact the opposite. He would have noted that neither Hebrews, Jews, nor Egyptians, Muslims, are presently indigenous to either nation, Israel or Palestine, and Egypt or Sais. The Vulgate Bible, the official Latin Old and New Testament from which St. Augustine based his authority on Christianity, was only one of the many Latin versions during the period after Latin was made the official language of the Roman Catholic Church by Tertullian, one of the indigenous African fathers of the Church. It was also from this version that most of the common vernacular versions that followed were made. During this period, Latin was the language of the entire Roman Empire, but Christians in Ethiopia, the first Christian nation in history, spoke Ge'ez or Ge'ez, then the national language of Ethiopia, which is today only used for the purpose of religious ceremonies. It too has been replaced by the new national language of Ethiopia, Amharic, in secular matters. It must be also noted that the Greek Christians used Greek, the language in which the first Christian Bible, the Septuagint, was written. The oldest body of Christians in the world as an institution, the Copts of Egypt, wrote Coptic, when Christians today begin to understand that the original text of the Vulgate Bible followed many Greek and Coptic versions, which before them followed many other Hebrew and Aramaic versions of the Torah, 5 books of Moses, or the Christians' Old Testament, hopefully they will begin to question just how much of the current allegedly original stories within any of them are truly valid or truthful. The Vulgate version, however, is the only version in which St. Augustine and St. Ambrose, along with the other church fathers, labored. Therefore, that which seems to be discrepancies in St. Augustine's works with respect for the previous versions of the Christian Holy Bible, conflicting interpretations by contemporary translators who have digressed from the original Vulgate version, which Augustine followed. In conjunction with the latter remarks, the following work by another of the indigenous Africans known to the world as the Fathers of the Church, Caecilius Cyprianus, Saint Cyprian, while Bishop of Carthage, 249 to 258 CE, was written. The pitiful condition of the lapsed, the result of general laxity, verses 4 to 6. Verse 4. These heavenly crowns of the martyrs, these spiritual triumphs of the confessors, these outstanding exploits of our brethren cannot, alas, remove one cause of sorrow, that the enemy's violence and slaughter has wrought havoc amongst us, and has torn away something from our very heart, and cast it to the ground. What shall I do, dear brethren, in the face of this? My mind tosses this way and that. What shall I say? How shall I say it? Tears and not words can alone express the grief which so deep a wound in our body calls for, which the great gaps in our once numerous flock evoke from our hearts. What could be so callous, so stony-hearted, who so unmindful of brotherly love as to remain dry-eyed in the presence of so many of his own kin who are broken now, shadows of their former selves, disheveled in the trappings of grief? Will he not burst into tears at the sight of them, before finding words for his sorrow? Believe me, my brothers, I share your distress, and can find no comfort in my own escape and safety. For the shepherd feels the wounds of his flock more than they do. My heart bleeds with each one of you. I share the weight of your sorrow and distress. I mourn with those that mourn. I weep with those that weep. With the fallen, I feel I have fallen myself. My limbs too were struck by the arrows of the lurking foe. His angry sword pierced my body too. When persecution rages, the mind of none escaped free and unscathed. When my brethren fell, my heart was struck, and I fell at their side. The above quotation is an English translation by Maurice Bevenot from the Latin original of The Lapsed. He also translated Saint Cyprian's The Unity of the Catholic Church, of which the following is taken. The Unity of the Catholic Church. The devil's wiles must be unmasked and overcome by obedience to Christ's commands. Verses 1 and 2. Our Lord solemnly warns us, "You are the salt of the earth," and bids us in our love of good to be not only simple, but prudent as well. Accordingly, dearest brethren, what else ought we to do but be on our guard and watch vigilantly, in order to know the snares of our earthly foe and to avoid them? Otherwise, after putting on Christ, who is the wisdom of God the Father, we may be found to have failed in wisdom for the care of our souls. For it is not persecution alone that is to be feared, nor those things which advance by open attack to overwhelm and cast down the servants of God. Caution is more easy where danger is manifest, and the mind is prepared beforehand for the contest when the adversary avows himself. The enemy is more to be feared and to be guarded against when he creeps on us secretly, when, deceiving by the appearance of peace, he steals forward by hidden approaches, whence also he has received the name of the serpent. That is always his subtlety. That is his dark and stealthy artifice for circumventing man. Thus, from the very beginning of the world he deceived, and, flattering with lying words, he misled inexperienced souls by an incautious credulity. Thus he endeavored to tempt the Lord himself. He secretly approached him, as if he would creep on him again and deceive. Yet he was understood and beaten back, and therefore prostrated, because he was recognized and detected. From which an example is given us to avoid the way of the old man, to stand in the footsteps of a conquering Christ, that we may not again be incautiously turned back into the nets of death, but, foreseeing our danger, may possess the immortality that we have received. But how can we possess immortality unless we keep those commands of Christ, whereby death is driven out and overcome, when he himself warns us, and says, "If you will enter into life, keep the commandments." And again, "If you do the things that I command you, henceforth I call you not servants, but friends." Finally, these persons he calls strong and steadfast. These he declares to be founded in robust security upon the rock, established with immovable and unshaken firmness, in opposition to all the tempests and hurricanes of the world. "Whosoever," says he, "hears my words and does them, I will liken him unto a wise man that built his house upon a rock. The rain descended, the floods came, the winds blew, and beat upon that house, and it fell not, for it was founded upon a rock." We ought therefore to stand fast on his words, to learn and do whatever he both taught and did. But how can a man say that he believes in Christ, who does not do what Christ commanded him to do? Or whence shall he attain to the reward of faith, who will not keep the faith of the commandment? He must of necessity waver and wander, and, caught away by a spirit of error, like dust which is shaken by the wind, be blown about, and he will make no advance in his walk toward salvation, because he does not keep the truth of the way of salvation. Cyprian continued in chapters 3 to 5 to warn against heresy and schism, noting that Christ founded the church on Peter. One can see the very distinct differences between Saint Cyprian and Saint Augustine. Also Tertullian's work, in the following abstracts taken from one of the latter's masterpieces, the treatise against Hermogenes, as translated into English from the original Latin text by J.H. Wozniak. In describing Hermogenes, Tertullian wrote, "Forward. Who is Hermogenes? We are accustomed, for the purpose of shortening argument, to lay down the rule against heretics of the lateness of their date. For in as far as by our rule priority is given to the truth, which also foretold that there would be heresies, in so far must all later opinions be prejudged as heresies, being such as were, by the more ancient rule of truth, predicted as one day to happen. Now the doctrine of Hermogenes has this taint of novelty. He is, in short, a man living in the world at the present time, by his very nature a heretic, a turbulent withal, who mistakes loquacity for eloquence, and supposes impudence to be firmness, and judges it to be the duty of a good conscience to speak ill of individuals. Moreover, he despises God's law in his painting, maintaining repeated marriages, alleges the law of God in defense of lust, and yet despises it in respect of his art. He falsifies by a twofold process, with his cautery and his pen. He is a thorough adulterer, both doctrinally and carnally, since he is rank indeed with the contagion of your marriage hacks, and has also failed in cleaving to the rule of faith as much as the apostles' own Hermogenes. However, never mind the man, when it is his doctrine which I question. He does not appear to acknowledge any other Christ as Lord, though he holds him in a different way. But by this difference in his faith, he really makes him another being. Nay, he takes from him everything which is God, since he will not have it that he made all things of nothing. For turning away from Christians to the philosophers, from the church to the academy and the porch, he learned there from the Stoics how to place matter on the same level with the Lord, just as if it too had existed, ever both unborn and unmade, having no beginning at all nor end, out of which, according to him, the Lord afterwards created all things. In the following 2 chapters, Tertullian outlined Hermogenes' main position as he saw them. Chapter 2 alone is cited here. The basic arguments of Hermogenes. Chapter 2. Our very bad painter has colored this his primary shade absolutely without any light, with such arguments as these. He begins with laying down the premise that the Lord made all things either out of himself, or out of nothing, or out of something, in order that, after he has shown that it was impossible for him to have made them either out of himself or out of nothing, he might thence affirm the residuary proposition that he made them out of something, and therefore that that something was matter. He could not have made all things, he says, of himself, because whatever things the Lord made of himself would have been parts of himself. But he is not dissoluble into parts, because, being the Lord, he is indivisible and unchangeable and always the same. Besides, if he had made anything out of himself, it would have been something of himself. Everything, however, both which was made and which he made, must be accounted imperfect, because it was made of a part, and he made it of a part. Or if again it was a whole which he made, who is a whole himself, he must in that case have been at once both a whole and yet not a whole, because it behooved him to be a whole, that he might produce himself, and yet not a whole, that he might be produced out of himself. But this is a most difficult position, for if he were in existence, he could not be made, for he was in existence already. If, however, he were not in existence, he could not make, because he was a non-entity. He maintains, moreover, that he who always exists does not come into existence, but exists forever and ever. He accordingly concludes that he made nothing out of himself, since he never passed into such a condition as made it possible for him to make anything out of himself. In like manner, he contends that he could not have made all things out of nothing. Thus he defines the Lord as a being who is good, nay, very good, who must will to make things as good and excellent as he is himself. Indeed, it were impossible for him either to will or to make anything which was not good. nay, very good itself. Therefore all things ought to have been made good and excellent by him, after his own condition. Experience shows, however, that things which are even evil were made by him, not of course of his own will and pleasure, because if it had been of his own will and pleasure, he would be sure to have made nothing unfitting or unworthy of himself. That, therefore, which he made not of his own will must be understood to have been made from the fault of something, and that is, from matter, without a doubt. In defense of his Christian teachings and to protect the reputation of the Vulgate Bible of the Christian Church, used during his reign as quote-unquote father of the Church, Tertullian wrote the rest of his entire treatise. The following extract is from chapter 4. In chapters 5 through 45, he used quotations from every book in the Latin Vulgate Bible text to refute Hermogenes. He wrote, A. Matter as equal to God. Chapter 4. At this point, then, I shall begin to treat of matter, how that, according to Hermogenes, God compares it with himself as equally unborn, equally unmade, equally eternal, set forth as being without a beginning, without an end. For what other estimate of God is there than eternity? What other condition has eternity then to have ever existed, and to exist yet for evermore by virtue of its privilege of having neither beginning nor end? Now, since this is the property of God, it will belong to God alone, whose property it is. Of course, on this ground, that if it can be ascribed to any other being, it will no longer be the property of God, but will belong, along with him, to that being also to which it is ascribed. For although there be that are called gods in the name, whether in heaven or in earth, yet to us there is but one God the Father, of whom are all things. Whence the greater reason why, in our view, that which is the property of God ought to be regarded as pertaining to God alone, and why, as I have already said, that should cease to be such a property when it is shared by another being. Now, since he is God, it must necessarily be a unique mark of this quality that it be confined to one. Else, what will be unique and singular, if that is not which has nothing equal to it? What will be principal, if that is not which is above all things, before all things, and from which all things proceed? By possessing these, he is God alone, and by his sole possession of them, he is one. If another also shared in the possession, there would then be as many gods as there were possessors of these attributes of God. Hermogenes therefore introduces two gods. He introduces matter as God's equal. God, however, must be one, because that is God which is supreme. But nothing else can be supreme than that which is unique, and that cannot possibly be unique which has anything equal to it. And matter will be equal with God when it is held to be eternal. Tertullian closed his treatise on Hermogenes in the same dramatic fashion in which he opened it. In the closing, one, alas, sees the same brashness which made him stand out so differently from St. Augustine and St. Cyprian. For whereas his other two indigenous African successors, fathers of the Church, were solely theologians concerned primarily with the soul and its heavenly entry, also law and order in the Church, he, on the other hand, was engaged with challenging individuals, including the hierarchy of the Church in Rome and North Africa, who dared to differ with what he felt was truth in relationship to his own religious tenets, in respect to the role of the Church and social action as against its heavenly goals of sending people to heaven. He wrote, Epilogue. And thus, in as far as it has been established that matter did not exist, also for the reason that it cannot have been such as it is represented, insofar is it proved that all things were made by God out of nothing. I would add only that, by delineating a condition of matter quite like his own, irregular, confused, turbulent, with a disordered, rash, and violent motion, Hermogenes has put on exhibition a sample of his art. He has painted his own portrait. There are many books listed in the bibliography that this author used in preparing this chapter, which should also prove to be extremely helpful to anyone who wishes to pursue in greater details the indigenous African fathers of the church works. There are many other translations from the original Latin text into several languages, the most common being in French, English, and German. Like St. Augustine, there is not very much written about St. Cyprian and Tertullian's lives before they became the spiritual leaders of the North African Christian Church and all of Christendom in general. There is not much about their personal lives during their reign as philosophers of their religion either. Were it not for their brief, sketchy background of themselves, as stated in their works, nothing of their non-Christian lives as indigenous Africans with their own traditional African religions would have been known. Of course, there were many who dared to make certain assumptions about their lives, but without any success whatsoever. One can only wonder why Tertullian was not made a saint. He certainly did as much for Christianity and Christendom to make them what they are today as did the other two indigenous African so-called Negroes, etc., fathers of the church, St. Cyprian and St. Augustine. Added to all of this, he was an activist, more than a philosopher, a kind of 16th century CE Catholic priest, Martin Luther, and the 20th century CE Protestant minister, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. conglomerate. Tertullian matched his Christian idealism with physical action, whereas the others sat back and philosophized on Christian doctrine and ethics. Maybe someday this African, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., also shall be made a saint in his church. However, the lack of such confirmation does not in any way whatsoever lessen his greatness. This is more so true when one considers that the greatest pacifist of modern times, Mohandas, the sacred one, Karamchand Gandhi, will never become a saint, solely because he was not a Christian confessant. It would have been unlikely, however, that Cyprian and Augustine would have made sainthood in the racist world of the 20th century CE, especially when considering that they were indigenous Africans and totally Judeo-Christian. One could suspect that there are very few Christian churches in the United States of America where they would have been tolerated, much less welcomed. Yet, they were the originators of most of the basic tenets which all of Christendom today believe. The only reason that the three indigenous African popes of the Roman Catholic Church have not been examined here should be obvious. If not, it is because they have done nothing outstanding in the history of Christendom, like most of their fellow popes who were not outstanding leaders. End of chapter 2.